The year is 1999, and I'm doing the most 1999 thing in the world, which is watching the MTV Video Music Awards in my parents' basement.
Whether you're riding high or just laid back, roll into the tents by this fall and get into new seasons of Biorhythm, Fanatic, Celebrity Deathmatch, and the Tom Green Show. All bounce to the ounce.
You guys got it made, Randy. You have no idea how it was back in the Genesis days. We couldn't think, couldn't adjust. Look what you got. Our receivers couldn't do that, and our defense sucked. You'll never get beat by the same whack play over and over. You better appreciate what you got, Junior. Hey, let me go.
I think Ojimbo got hold of a bad taco.
Hey, I'm a legend.
NFL 2K on Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
Whereas Genesis was considered the Pepsi to Nintendo's Coke. In 1999, it seemed like whatever Sega was going to do would end up being the Jolt Cola. If you were to have made the mistake of talking to 15 to 17-year-old me between the years 1998 and 2001, there's a good chance I would have brought up the Sega Dreamcast. My well-researched statements may have included, "The Dreamcast is the greatest console of all time. Sony doesn't care about gaming. Oh, you don't trust Sega after the Saturn? Fine, go play Madden, douchebag. We don't want you anyway. Sega and Al Gore 2000. It's been 20 years, and I finally think I'm ready to say that the Sega Dreamcast may have not been the greatest console of all time. It might not have been the best console of the generation, or even a legitimately good console. However, it was special, so here's a video about the Dreamcast and what it meant to me. If you were to squint really hard at any angle of the Dreamcast today, you could see the future of entertainment. Sega did it before it was cool, and it's such a bummer that the company didn't get to profit off any of the Dreamcast's innovation. Obviously, there's the modem and SegaNet. At least 10 years ahead of its time, but totally playable over 56K. I would buy any game I could get my hands on that had that multiplayer online logo. Quake 3, Alien Front Online, Daytona USA, even Choo Choo Rocket, which was technically before SegaNet came out. Online play even got a devout anti-sports ball person like myself to request a copy of NFL 2K1 for Christmas. In the year 2000, it was unheard of to have a console game with the scope and features of Phantasy Star Online. Sonic Team thought so far ahead, they even had a functional emoji system that you could use to chat across language barriers. The Dreamcast was laughably not ready for some innovation, like downloadable content when the primary storage device has about 100K of usable memory. But it doesn't matter. The boldness of Sega's online offerings wouldn't be attempted until very late in the life of the Xbox. When the Xbox One and PS4 were released in 2013, a hot feature to tout was the off-TV gameplay using a tablet or smartphone. I think the Microsoft version was called Smart Glass, but the implementation was barely comparable to what the Dreamcast Visual Memory Unit was doing back in 1999. The VMU was a pretty cool unit, even though most of the off-screen stuff for Dreamcast was silly, and the sound of a dead VMU battery still haunts my dreams. There are about a dozen more trailblazing things that were built into the Dreamcast system. One of the easiest to overlook items was the Windows CE sticker on the unit. This was in response to previous systems like the Sega Saturn being difficult to develop for, and this allowed publishers a cheap way to port computer games and any other game to serve a new audience. And 20 years later, we see the primary selling point of game engines like Unreal or Unity being cross-compatibility. Build it for one, port it to the others. And today, both leading consoles are built from the off-the-shelf computer parts for the same reason. Even with innovation coming out of its modem port, a video game system is only as good as the games that were made for it. The Dreamcast game library tells a very interesting story that is a direct response to the Sega Saturn. The Saturn launched too early and did not have the quantity or quality of Sega titles that resonated with global audiences. The Dreamcast, on the other hand, had 141 games published in whole, or in part by Sega, of which 58 made it to the US. This included 2 mainline Sonic games,
3 new RPG franchises, a sports game for almost every major American interest, and as many arcade games as there were able to be crammed onto a GD-ROM.
Soul Calibur!
The audacity of Sega's output over the 2.5 years of the Dreamcast's life is to be commended. It is probably why the system has remained in the hearts of gamers over the past 20 years.
The Dreamcast in my mind is a twofold experience in that so much of what I played early on in the Dreamcast lifetime and early on in my lifetime set my tastes for years to come. And then 15, 20 years later, when I really dug back into the Dreamcast, I started finding games I had never heard of that I also ended up really enjoying. So not only was it a tastemaker when I was a toddler, it's become a tastemaker now that I'm 20 years old, 22 years old. And it's really fascinating like that. A 20-year-old console continues to surprise me. And I think those are some of my favorite experiences, or when the Dreamcast throws another thing at me that I never would have imagined either existing or liking.
This is the part where I talk about the top 10 Sega Dreamcast games. These are the ones that, as I look back, have stuck with me and I actually want to play.
Phantasy Star Online. Today, it's a slow, online third-person Diablo. But in the year 2000, it blew my mind that a game could have this much depth. The music still gets stuck in my head for no reason, and the Dragon Boss is probably one of the most visually impressive things to come out of the system. You know, someone online once ripped me off 20,000 of the in-game currency because the game didn't really have a trading interface. Both parties just had to drop their junk on the ground at the same time, and in this instance, he took my money and left. One day I'm gonna find this person in real life and kill them for breaking my 17-year-old heart.
So I have a ton of favorite game experiences because the software library for the Dreamcast is just absolutely incredible. There's so many classics that hold up to this day in terms of their gameplay, but the one that always stood out to me the most was Skies of Arcadia, 100%. And to this day, there's never really been a game that's created that kind of atmosphere, that camaraderie, exploration, and just fun that Skies of Arcadia had. It's like if you got like One Piece, Final Fantasy, and just Sega all bundled up into one adventure. And it just happened to help me through one of the toughest periods of my life.
Shenmue. In the year 2018, I bought the re-release, and I also backed the Kickstarter for Shenmue 3. I'm sad to say this series definitely does not hold up. However, in 1999, it laid the groundwork for open-world games in terms of detail and technology. It's also one of the few games where you don't just go around killing people to progress. You have plenty of fights, but it's mostly a slow, local mystery, and that scope should be commended.
Crazy Taxi!
This was the first game I purchased for the Dreamcast, and the one that's easiest to go back to this day. Unlike a lot of home arcade ports to the Dreamcast, it has the depth to support a full-price purchase. The amount of ports this game has received has dampened the amount of nostalgia I have for it, but the Dreamcast version is the only one that I've found with the full corny soundtrack.
Planet Ring was my sole gaming experience online. Even that, as a primitive, basic online mini-game collection, I thought it was really fantastic. I thought this was steps ahead in the future. Got your own little redemption code that you put in on Dream Arena, or Sega Net as it's called in North America, but yeah, it's Dream Arena over here. And it was absolutely fantastic. I really would have liked to have played more games online with the Dreamcast.
Jet Grind Radio!
Jet Grind Radio is the best style I've seen in a video game. The art, music, and setting are so perfectly blended to show the Japan that I always wanted to go to and yet probably never really existed. The gameplay isn't quite as good as it looks, and I remember this one being insanely hard on the Dreamcast, while the Xbox sequel was way too easy. Dynamite Cop, Zombie Revenge, Cannon Spike. I'm just going to dump these three together because I can. Die Hard Arcade was one of my favorite arcade games as a kid, and Streets of Rage was one of my favorite Genesis games. These 3 games were the successors that I was most happy to come back to when putting this video together. There's something about a fast, clean game that can be completed in about 15 to 30 minutes with a ridiculous story. None of these are probably worth the original purchase price, but I would definitely pick up an HD version in a heartbeat.
Welcome to Power Stone War.
There's a better future where the Smash Bros. Games failed and Power Stone succeeded. These games blended the chaos of a party game and the complexity of a fighting game even better than Smash. The sequel possibly took things too far when combining the increased 4-player mode with stages that were actively trying to kill you, but it's still great. If you were to plaster some known franchises on this, it would still be played today. It's a pretty big shame that the only port these have gotten was to the Sony PlayStation Portable. 17-year-old Charlie paid $120 for this setup, and I believe with inflation that cost would be about $400,000 in today's money. It doesn't matter, because this is the beginning of the plastic instrument craze in my mind, and it even one-ups Guitar Hero by making you look like a crazy person.
Virtua Tennis.
Virtua Tennis holds the prestigious award of Game that was available to be played on a random TV during my high school graduation open house. I think it was because I played tennis poorly in high school, and anyone can mash buttons in this game and think they are the greatest player of all time. I'm just going to end this segment by the satisfying sounds of volleys, because I remember that sound sparking joy in my 17-year-old heart.
14 love. So there are my 10 or so favorite games for the system. There are probably 10 more I could add to it, and after that, you could probably throw the whole Dreamcast library in the trash and the world would remain the same. I was originally going to play every single Dreamcast game to celebrate the system's 20-year anniversary. But about 30 games in alphabetically, it made me realize that there's a lot of junk on this system. If not junk, then games that were ports or evolved upon or moved away from in the interest of today's gamer. This isn't necessarily a put-down for the system, because I'm not sure what I could get over 20 or 30 games on a quote-unquote successful system that would be worth the time. There's a notable absence on my list of the Sonic Adventure games. I think I owned and beat both of them, but even in 1999, I could tell they were rushed, and aside from some wow moments like that whale or city escape, they were filled with a lot of padding. I'm glad they exist and have probably spawned a generation of furries. But it wasn't what I was looking for then, and certainly not now. If I had a timer to track where I spent most of my time on the Dreamcast, it might have been with the demo discs that were included with the system and the official Dreamcast magazine. Because so many games for the system were arcade ports, the demo discs gave me enough time to play a 10-minute loop of the game without investing a ton of time or money into it. And in the endless opportunity of late 1999, that's the amount of time and effort I was looking for. It's been tough for me to bring up any flaws with the Dreamcast. Not because they're hard to find, but because I take them as a problem with myself, or a problem with the 17-year-old me. After years in the wilderness with the Sega CD, the 32X, and the Saturn, Sega was just getting its act together, putting the work in and not holding anything back to rejoin the industry. If Sega could turn it around with the Dreamcast, maybe I could turn it around and be a normal member of society. However, even when it was looking hopeful on 9/9/99 for Sega, there was an undercurrent of dread, and that dread's name was the PlayStation 2. Enough with this metaphor, and let's not even get started with Sony. Let's get back to the problems with the Dreamcast. The most glaring system-related issue, even in 1999, was the Dreamcast controller, with the lack of buttons and a second analog stick. I honestly don't know what Sega was thinking. They tried to distance the Dreamcast as just being another arcade machine, but that's pretty much all the controller could handle without being annoying. Many of the design decisions were made in Japan, and maybe first-person shooters and action games hadn't quite taken hold there at the time. The lack of a second analog stick made otherwise competent action games like Quake 3, Fur Fighters, Mac and X, MDK2, an absolute chore to play, and it probably scared other decent ports off the system. I feel like I'm moving or I'm looking, not both.
I feel like a dog with one of those cones over its heads.
So you've heard about DVD.
Have you seen DVD?
Well, this is DVD.
As a Monday morning quarterback, I still wonder if playing DVDs would have changed the fate of the Dreamcast. It may have gotten more early adopters on board, and also taken some wind out of the PS2 excitement. A side benefit would have also been reducing the amount of piracy on the system, which was rampant. It was probably a cost decision, or maybe Sega had to make a choice between the modem and upgrading to DVD.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
The story is that EA wanted sports exclusivity, which wasn't going to happen with Sega's investment in Visual Concepts, nor should it have. If it were to have happened, it would have been really interesting to see if Sega's US resources could have been spent in other areas.
オリエンテッドなビジネスモデルに早急に移行し、今後の収益回復を確実するために、今回ドリームキャストの製造中止を決定いたしました。
Yeah, it really upset me. I'd spent a good portion of time, a bunch of time in my school years, convincing my friends that Sega were the console manufacturer. They'd been on the market for so long. Their consoles were absolutely fantastic. I used to make these VHS tapes for a couple of non-believers in my friends group that hated Sega and the Dreamcast and thought the Dreamcast was absolutely rubbish when it came to graphics and gameplay. And I used to create these videos. And yeah, they did agree. They were like, yes, these games do look pretty darn good actually, and fun. And for that to then backfire and the announcement comes and all the games end up just getting spilled out onto the other machines was heartbreaking, really.
Okay, wait. Sonic was only on this Sega console, and now Sonic is on the GameCube, the PS2, and the Xbox. And as a, I guess, 5 years old at that point, that was kind of the way that I dug into Sega's history in the video game industry. Because we didn't have a Genesis, we didn't have a Master System, we didn't have a Saturn. All we had was a Dreamcast. But I could see that something had changed between the Dreamcast's release and the PS2's release.
Yeah, Sega were no longer making hardware, they were going into just creating software on all the rival formats, starting with Game Boy Advance and going over to PS2, GameCube, and then the original Xbox. And yeah, it really upset me.
And I felt somber when it ended because the game stopped coming out for it. But after seeing the Jet Set Radio cameo in Travis Strikes Again for the Switch, the Space Channel 5 the revival in VR, and just the surviving community that continues to put out games for it, I can see that it meant as much to others as it meant to me. The Dreamcast is a special thing, and I hope Sega's legacy with the Dreamcast lives forever.
More recently, I've gotten into the homebrew connection for online games on the Dreamcast, like Phantasy Star Online, and some of the other games that had online multiplayer. There's still actually a thriving community of people who are using some wild devices and software to make their Dreamcast continue to connect to the internet. That's been a really interesting project and a lot of fun to tinker around with in 2019, 20 years after the Dreamcast came out.
I was a child when the Sega Dreamcast was released. I was a child when the Sega Dreamcast was released. In 1999... Okay. I was a child when the Sega Dreamcast was released. In 1999... This doesn't feel right. I need a location change. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the lovely opening. This feels right. This feels where we should talk about this type of stuff. As with any good eulogy, I'll be beginning and ending this with a Bible verse. 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. I was a child when the Sega Dreamcast was released. At 15 years old in 1999, I didn't have much joy in my life. Frankly, I was afraid of or hated everything. And the Sega Dreamcast gave me something to be passionate about. I felt like I was fighting for this video game system. So pretty much I was a Sega fanboy. Definitions of a fanboy range from someone who's merely an advocate of something to an unthinking pawn of a company or brand. I fit every definition of a fanboy of the Sega Dreamcast. And I probably still do now. I remember after the PlayStation 2 launched, I was working at a local retailer and someone came back with a defective unit to return it. And instead of listening to them, I immediately launched into why they should return it and get a Sega Dreamcast and a couple games. Like online play, the catalog is better, the games are cheaper, everything. And the person left in a huff, and it was either because I was crazy or because we didn't have any replacement PlayStation 2s because the demand was so high. If any brand or entertainment option deserves a fanboy, it is Sega and the Sega Dreamcast. Sega had the balls to bring everything they could to this system. I've mentioned some of this hot Sega Dreamcast games, but even to this day, the second year, fall 2000, Sega releases astounds me. It's more than any publisher or system manufacturer put out. Between August and November that year, Sega put out the following: Seaman, WWF Royal Rumble, Echo the Dolphin, Sega Marine Fishing, D2, Sega GT, F355 Challenge, Quake 3 Arena, Samba de Amigo, Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Skies of Arcadia, and Sonic Shuffle. Now, not all these games were good, especially Sonic Shuffle, but that's 13 significant releases, not counting the 2K Sports lineup. And it still wasn't enough. The system still failed. It was enough for me, though. When I fail, I hope it's with the passion and the strength of will that Sega did with the Dreamcast. And when I fail, I hope I have the resources and the backbone to own that failure the way Sega did. After announcing plans to discontinue the Sega Dreamcast in January 2001, the Sega president gave up almost $500 million of company stock and personal assets to keep Sega afloat. He did this voluntarily. Any other executive would have just washed their hands of the situation or possibly even killed themselves. But not Isao Okawa and not Sega. So on this 20th US anniversary of the Dreamcast, I am finally ready to be free of the fanboy in me. And I'm ready to put away the weird amounts of anger that I have towards Sony, the game industry, and life in general. However, I and others across the world will forever hold on to the spirit of the Sega Dreamcast. 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Thank you for being a part of this, and thank you, Sega.
I like being on my lonesome. Go on, away with ya. I don't much like being bothered. I find it rather tiresome, you see, speaking